Thanks so much for staying with us here on the AM Report. A warm welcome if you've just tuned in. I'm Michelle Craig. Now, the State of the Nation address gives the President an opportunity to speak to the nation on the general state of affairs in the country. And tonight's address comes at a time when President Cyril Ramaphosa is under immense pressure, with the country facing a myriad of challenges. That includes unemployment, reigniting the economy, rampant corruption, and of course, growing COVID-19 issues. So this morning we ask, what is the real state of our nation? What are the aspirations of ordinary South Africans? We'll unpack it all for you. Joining us now is journalist and social justice activist Nolwazi Tusini, and also Wits University's School of Governance lecturer Khotsi Chikane. To both of our guests, thanks very much for coming in. Nolwazi, good morning. It's the first time we're saying good morning to each other.
Yes. Thank you so much for having us this morning.
It's great to have you both in studio. It's great to have guests in studio for the first time in many months.
Time,
at a socially distanced and responsible way. Nolwazi, I want to begin with you and talk about, how far we've come since SONA 2020. I mean, 2020 was a few years long, we can all agree. Mm-hmm. It was when the EFF stalled the State of the Nation address for 90 minutes, as you both obviously remember. And one of the key takeaways from the President last year in his State of the Nation address was that this is going to be a year of inclusive growth. That was 2020. How does that picture change now, post-pandemic, 1 year later?
Well, I mean, I think we're being generous if we just look at it from 2020. The President has given us, I think, about 3 States of the Nation's address, but basically he's been in power for over 1,000 days. At this point. And as it stands, from the very first State of the Nation that he delivered to today, very few of the things that he's promised us have come to fruition, right? And I say that it's generous for us to begin the conversation of 2020 because with 2020, you have the excuse of COVID-19, right? Of this unprecedented global pandemic. And this is why, for example, we lost 2.2 million people lost their jobs last year. But even before COVID-19, the President was making promises. It's almost like, a friend who comes to you unsolicited and says, friend, I'll do this for you and that. And you didn't even ask for it. And then days later, they break their own promise, one that you did not ask for in the first instance. This is the sort of like toxic relationship that South African citizens are in with our President as it stands.
Yeah. In fact, the Daily Maverick has a very interesting, I was just on my phone looking for it now, it has a very interesting article by Ferial Haffajee today talking about those over 1,000 days the President has been in office. And it has a list of promises that he's made in his past 3 State of the Nation addresses. And very few of them, Khotsi, have a tick to say that has been delivered on.
Yeah. I mean, there's a fundamental failure when it comes to State of the Nation addresses, and the failure is that there's no accountability mechanisms attached to it. So essentially it becomes a talk show. And this is not just during the Ramaphosa years, this goes all the way back to the Mbeki years, but it's a platform for the executive to announce what they're going to do, but it doesn't have any institutional mechanisms that say, if you fail to do X, Y, Z, what are the consequences of it, right? Anyone who knows anything about disciplining, about management, if you put no sense of institutional accountability for promises, someone can continue to promise year in, year out. So I hear the narrative, which is, I hope the President gives the country a bit of hope. Giving the country hope is very, very easy, right? You go out and you say, I'm going to promise jobs, right? In a country where there's unemployment, poverty, gender-based violence, etc., promising something is very easy to give people hope. Actually fulfilling those promises becomes the real test of your integrity, a real test of your leadership, and we failed across the board, whether it's the executive, whether it's Parliament. And I think that's the problem that we have with our SONA, that it's designed in a manner that doesn't hold people accountable, but becomes this mechanism that gives people false hope every year that allows this rot to continue.
Yeah. I mean, we've been asking our viewers in a poll question what they hope to hear from the President this evening. And the truth of it is that there are so many issues to choose from.
Yeah.
To see real action from President Cyril Ramaphosa on, for example, let's start with the issue of corruption. That's taken on a whole new meaning, hasn't it, Nolwazi?
Absolutely.
Given the corruption in the midst of a pandemic with the procurement of PPE?
Yeah. And I mean, the corruption problem in South Africa has gotten so bad. If you take a look at social media, South Africans don't even believe that the state will be able to deliver vaccinations without there being corruption in the delivery of vaccinations. That's how lowly we think of our state, right, Michelle? And for me, I think it was with the corruption with the PPE was when I completely almost lost hope, any kind of hope. There was a new law that I could not have ever imagined as a citizen of this country. And for me as well, we're living in a situation where there is so much collective grief, right? It's not just grieving lost loved ones, we're grieving the mundane, the ability to sit close to one another, right? And even in the midst of that, you have leaders who do not even want to show symbolic leadership, who will walk into a funeral and bury their loved one in a manner that they always have when we've had to give up the way that we bury people, walk into a funeral without a mask when the president 2 weeks before was on television telling us that it is illegal not to wear masks. So the executive in this country, our leaders do not even care about a symbolic leadership. They don't even want to give us that small piece. So, I mean, in terms of actually fulfilling their jobs, why would we expect that?
Hoti, that sounds, I mean, it sounds incredibly harsh on the face of it, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean...
But we're both nodding.
Yeah, no, because it's the reality of the situation. Right, so when you look at the State Capture Commission, and I love commissions in our country because they really grab our attention, and then it takes 2 years for them to come out with a report, and then the recommendations disappear into some dark vault, never to be really implemented in any particular way.
The money all gone with it
right?
as well.
Yeah.
We become so engrossed by the theater of politics, right? The theater of the theatrics of a tea party that two people want to have, and becomes this major modus operandi of how we interact with parliamentarians or politicians. But what we really lack is, I care very little about the theater. I care very little about how you publicly show face as a politician in this country. What I care about is, are you doing the work? And if you don't do the work, how do I hold you accountable? And not accountable with a slap on the wrist or a little letter that says, I reprimanded this person, but by
or perhaps
saying,
a suspension on full pay for a year.
A suspension, full pay, or just saying you're not a good enough minister. And there's nothing complicated about it.
But you'll stay in the job for the next few years.
Yeah, no, you leave the job, right? This idea that a minister should stay in their job because they have to be found for some really horrendous crime for them to be removed. Poor performance should remove you.
Yeah.
If an MP has poor performance, they should be removed as an MP by that political party. We don't have that culture across the political spectrum. It's not just the ANC. And I think that becomes the fault. And once that becomes entrenched and institutionalized, then the symbolic shows of affection to the country become insignificant in their eyes. When they have this belief that regardless of what happens, I will always be in my position because the status quo will remain, then nothing will change.
Listen, this is such a compelling conversation. I want you guys to both stay here, please. And it's a conversation we're going to be having virtually as well, just like the hybrid session in Parliament. Ayanda, who do you have for us?
Yeah, I mean, there's just so much to explore because there's so much to talk about. So 2 more guests we're going to add to the conversation. I beg your pardon, Palaitsile, yes, is a journalist. We've also got Stephanie Abrowski, who is an attorney. Both our guests for this leg of the conversation join us now virtually. To both of you, thanks for your time. Welcome to the AM Report. Stephanie, perhaps let me begin with you. The judiciary, already even before the pandemic, was under real pressure. How much attention should the president give to that aspect of how we even deal with things like COVID-19?
Morning, and thank you so much for having me. Yeah, what I really want the president to talk about is investing in developing our legal infrastructure. This system was under so much pressure before the pandemic, and the pandemic really brought it to its knees. The court's really trying to recover, but there's such deep challenges within the system, and these really need to be addressed, and they're absolutely crucial to the functioning of our democracy and to our rule of law. And this affects the economy, it affects small business. And so really what I'm looking for is the president addressing the administrative challenges that we face in our legal system.
Yeah, and Kgaupalele, of course, as journalists, we've also had our work cut out for us. But, because of the nature of what we do, typically we don't put ourselves at the front, so to speak. We often try not to be the story. I wonder whether that's kind of been a disadvantage, especially at moments where journalists also need to be seen. not only because of the other issues that are facing the country, but also because of the pandemic?
Yeah, thank you so much, Ayanda, for having me. I think one of the tests that journalists have had to go through during this pandemic is the centralization of information. It's been very hard to report this year and last year, and people have been calling us to order and asking us, why aren't you asking the right questions? But we are. And we are not getting the answers. And we are trying our best to ask the questions. We are trying our best to do the investigations. But the government has made it really hard for us to do our work. So I'm hoping that the president does touch on press freedom as well, and the fact that it has really been hard for us. But also, safety of journalists during this pandemic as well has been something that has been in my, I've been concerned about. I'm a journalist who contracted COVID. I know a lot of journalists contracted COVID as well. It's something that has been, a problem as well on how we report and how we are allowed to report. The virtual briefings have been, they've been horrible. They talk about the fourth industrial revolution and technology, but it's really not been easy for us to do that.
Yeah. The president last year also spoke about how at that time the country had to deal with the fundamentals. Stephanie, again, I'm sure COVID's going to be cited as one of the reasons why that hasn't happened, but do you think that is a fair sort of reason to provide, given how long-standing these issues have always been?
Yeah, not exactly. Like I said, this system was already under pressure way before the pandemic happened. And so the pandemic was just, the last straw on the camel's back. So we really need a focused intervention in terms of developing our legal system, improving the quality of those that preside over our matters, and finally giving access to lay people to manage their own legal matters. That's basically what would push our legal system into the next century.
Yeah, and it's only once you need the legal system, Stephanie, do people really think about, ways through which it should be strengthened. And this year, we've actually seen a lot of people needing to hold government to account. The question becomes, is the quality of the judiciary where it needs to be? And where does the president's address fit in all of that?
I think we can always strive for improvement. I think that as the years go on and as we get better and better in finalizing matters over the years, we will improve. It's not all a dark and gloomy picture. Yeah. However, we shouldn't lay that matter to rest. We should be continually trying to improve that system, continually funneling resources into that system in order to make it the best that it can be.
Right. Before we take the conversation back to our desk here in studio, journalism inevitably has changed because of this pandemic. I wonder, as we count down the hours to the president's address itself, how we can prepare to even adopt to ways through which we're going to have to cover tonight.
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to see how we do cover this. But Ayanda, I also want to say and be fair and say that South African journalism has changed, and I think our editors and us ourselves as journalists need to be accountable for the ways in which we ourselves haven't covered things the right way and the way people want them to write. We haven't investigated enough. And I think South Africans have the right to question that and call us out. So we need to do a lot of fact checking. We need to stop telling people just what the president said. We need to start telling people what is true about what the president said and where they have failed in what they have said. It shouldn't just be, this is what he had to say, this is what I'm giving you, this is the information. No, we need to dig deeper and show people, is this factual? Is this true? How is it true? And where are the statistics for it? And I think that's the challenge for us coming tonight, because this is going to be a very, very important State of the Nation address.
Yeah, the sentiment increasingly becoming accountability needs to exist across the board. My guest joining us virtually stand by. I wonder what your reflections are on that, guest.
Yeah, well, it's just gone 7:47. If you've just tuned in, we're here in studio with Nolwazi Tusini, who is a journalist and social justice activist, and Khotsi Shikane, who is a lecturer at Wits University's School of Governance. And Nolwazi, I want to pick up with you again and talk about the issue of accountability with government, insofar as we've heard this from the president many, many times over the past year of the pandemic, in that, all of us need to play our part, which we know. We need to play our part when it comes to preventing the spread of the virus, wear your mask, and so on. And then it comes to the issue of alcohol, another big issue in our country. The president again says it's in your hands, the issue around abuse of alcohol. But what about the root causes of alcohol abuse in our country?
I think the conversation around alcohol for me is a really frustrating one, because it seems to me that we have a police minister who is much more interested in policing alcohol than he is in policing gender-based violence, for example, or the rates of crime and robbery in this country. I mean, we are the unsafest right now, according to crime statistics, in any time since South Africa became a democracy. And when you see Begitele, he wants to talk to us about alcohol and doesn't want to talk to us about the social ills that lead to alcohol abuse, doesn't want to talk about the inequality that leads to it, the poverty that leads to it, I don't know how to put it, but it's almost like a perfect storm that South Africans are living in.
The history of it.
Yes, and the history of it, right? So there are a number of reasons why it is that South Africans, first of all, abuse alcohol in the way that they do, and then how that then relates to violence, right? But then we want to talk about
these are not separate
alcohol.
issues.
They're not. Everything is interlinked. But the problem is that I believe fundamentally, as Khosi was saying earlier on, is that our leaders across the board don't care about any kind of accountability. On every single metric in this country, we are failing. Be it education, be it health, be it inequality, poverty, we are failing. And yet the ministers don't change, right? So Begitele is failing us as a police minister. And we are subjected to him talking to us about alcohol on a regular basis without any kind of understanding about what it is that gets people to the high, levels of alcohol abuse that we have in this country. And this is not because the information is not available, right? The information is there. There is mounds and mounds of research that has been done by academics explaining the problem. They don't care to fix it, though.
I mean, the issue of accountability is a big one, as Ayanda has also said with his guests as well, Khotsi. And, for me, going into SONA 2021, there are so many things that I'm, going back on with 2020's speech. And I'm wondering to myself, how far have you got with this promise and that promise, Mr. President? And you talked about this before. There's no mechanism for us to hold the president accountable for the promises he's made in the past. And also, we're not seeing him take to the podium saying, this is what I promised last year. We haven't met that metric, but this is what we're going to do this year. I
mean, I remember being on a similar panel to this last year and saying, I wonder if the president's going to have a little checklist to say, I said this last year, this is my bad, I didn't do this, and I did this, and I didn't do that, and I don't think that's going to happen. I have no faith in it. What I can guarantee you is that more promises will be made. So I am willing to put 1,000 Rand on this. My own money to say he will talk about infrastructure, development in this country and investment. That won't actually ever happen. He'll talk about a brand new sort of youth employment initiative of some sort that will either fail or never happen or be defunct in its essence. He will talk about something around restructuring ESCOM, but never really give us the details about what's really stopping that from happening. And then he'll give us a tertiary comment around why we must respect the rule of law, why corruption is bad. But all of these are platitudes. Again, all of them are made to appease us.
And that's a fair comment, isn't it? These are platitudes because we have heard it too many times.
Exactly. Now, the danger that we have...
What I would add, sorry, Khosi, is that he's probably going to mention gender-based violence because now that's also become his, ticket. And all of us for a while. And I mean, I work in the gender-based violence space, and for a long time, I was so happy to hear a president who seemed to be taking it seriously, right? We had an entire commission after the total shutdown in 2018 where women, gave the 26 demands. If you were to look at how many of those demands have been met in the past 2 years, I think it's something ridiculous, like 6 of them.
And the danger with it is that in a situation such as pandemic, in the situation where there's so much misery, there's so much disarray, there's so much little hope about the future, hundreds of South Africans dying every day, we might hold on to these platitudes as good enough, but it's not. The scourge of gender-based violence in this country is not being dealt with. Unemployment is not being dealt with. Inequality hasn't been dealt with at all over the past 25 years. COVID can't be the excuse to allow the president to give more platitudes. It should actually be the motivating factor to say, enough's enough, it's time for fundamental change.
Now, both of you have said this before. SONA is not, we often talk about, will the president be able to give South Africans a glimmer of hope with his State of the Nation address this year? That's a common theme that you'll hear every year at SONA. But SONA is not the glimmer of hope. SONA is not going to bring about the change that both of you are talking about us needing as a country. If you're looking for hope, perhaps a closer mark would be the local government elections.
Michelle, I'm glad you mentioned the elections, because for me, the scariest thing is that I think fundamentally what Jose and I are saying is that we need new leaders in this country. We need an entirely new leadership. The scary thought for me is that there does not seem to be a suitable alternative to the African National Congress. I feel that the South African public is between a rock and a hard place. Our official opposition is not a party that the majority in this country can trust to lead. Neither is the EFF, which is the third largest party in this country. So where do we look? We all understand that we fundamentally need new leadership. We're going into local government elections. Who do we choose? What is the option? What is the alternative as it stands?
Yeah.
I would respond by saying, I think we should stop looking for alternative political parties and accept that the political system itself is broken.
Yeah.
Right? That the proportional-based system that elects officials into our national government and provincial government is fundamentally flawed in that it doesn't allow us to hold people accountable, and that we should change that system to allow opposition parties or the ruling party a new mechanism to run the country that is based on, if you do a bad job, your constituency will vote you out.
A different way of managing our leadership. Khoti, thanks for that. Ayanda, it's a difficult discussion we're having here at the news desk, because SONA is not, from the facts before us, the glimmer of hope we're looking for.
Absolutely. And I guess now we need to kind of guard against this idea of having some kind of messiah moment, right? To be able to resuscitate us from the situation we're in. But it's a family affair today. I've also got two guests joining us via our virtual feed for this discussion. Gaupalelwe Palaitile is a journalist, and Stephanie Abrowski is an attorney. You spent a lot of time dealing in the GBV space through the work you've done, et cetera, in some respects. We also know of now the Gender-Based Violence and Femicide Response Fund. Is that enough given the extent of the issue we're faced with? And if not, is there anything the president can say tonight to convince us that, he is taking this as seriously as he should?
Thank you, Ayanda. I think one thing about the response fund is that, firstly, we need to celebrate it. And I say this in context. For a lot of years, women have been fighting, activists have been fighting, and civil society have been fighting for us to get here. And I think it is some sort of a win. Although the sector, activists and all, feel like more needs to be done, I think now the eyes on how those funds are being used. Now we're going back to corruption, right? Now the question is are these funds going to be allocated correctly? Are they going to be used correctly? Who's going to be, where are these funds going to go? Are they really going to be given to civil society? So those are the questions that we are asking as a sector now, because we know that even in the GBV space and the activist space, government has also centralized information and has also centralized decisions. There's a lot of things that have been done coming to this fund where activists were locked out and didn't know what was happening, and were allowed in little bits by little pieces. And this is how this government operates, right? And that's where we are at now. As much as we are celebrating, the question is also, how do we as the GBV sector keep them accountable in using these funds correctly? So, because we know, like the other guests have said in studio, we are dealing with a government that has failed. We are dealing with politicians that have failed. So now the pressure is on us as activists and civil society organizations to keep them accountable for using their funds. It almost feels like we are nannies now, taking care of children.
Can you imagine? Steph, speaking about accountability, it becomes incredibly difficult to speak about COVID-19, the vaccines, and not also reflect on moments when the Chief Justice made comments that raised eyebrows. Should the president even address that in his address to the nation later today? Is it an important enough issue for the judiciary, considering the perceptions it created at least?
I think a lot of people put their trust in the Chief Justice. And so those kind of comments, I would probably say, not particularly helpful, but probably not to be addressed in the SONA, probably not the most appropriate space for it. But the president should have, at the time, address those issues and address those specific comments in regard to the pandemic. I really connected with the sentiment that the system underpinning our democratic system is broken, and that we do need that Messiah moment. We're all looking for this fresh, relevant, system to come into place to help us to succeed.
And of course, given the myriad of issues we have in this country, we could have our conversation literally till the president takes the podium, but we're going to have to fold it there. Thanks very much. Let me thank my two guests. Stephanie Broski is an attorney. Gaupaleli Palaitile is a journalist. Truly appreciate your time. But of course, we also had guests in the studio, Michelle.
Yeah, absolutely. Some compelling conversations here being had virtually and in studio. Let me thank you both for coming in. I think some of the key takeaways from our discussion: we need to have a better system of holding our leaders accountable. There needs to be a higher bar for holding a position of leadership in our country. Nolwazi Tusini is a journalist and social justice activist. Khotsi Chikane is a lecturer with Wits University's School of Governance. To all of our guests, thanks so much